Once upon a time, I only should have visited the emergency department one time. 218 times that I'm allowed to remember. So like there's at least 20 more. So I'm basically like on 240 somewhere. So like eventually when I get to somewhere over like 1,000, like that 20 is not going to matter anymore, you know, if I'm getting an armband every time. So yeah, like I won't, like I'll be like, oh, that time they didn't record, like that doesn't matter so much anymore, because yeah, it's okay, you know what I mean, unless they start like increasing that numbers again. But like yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm alive basically because like behind my back, I'm sure they're making decisions with regards to keeping me alive and not passing MAID, and then also like throwing hurdles my way. So one of the recent hurdles was basically just like, instead of assigning me a new psychiatrist, they referred me to an addictions clinic. And I was like, I'm not addicted to anything. Like you can test my system. If you think I'm addicted to something, like by all means, like test my system. You know? And then that little thing disappeared, but realistically, so like it worked, right? Because realistically, their little hurdle worked because I'm bringing it up right now and it's occupying my energy. And it's energy not spent getting assisted suicide, but I don't fucking care or discriminate with regards to getting assisted suicide. So like, you're gonna fucking throw hurdles my way, I'm gonna call it for what it is. It's a fucking hurdle. And then like, it's not fair either. So like, again, like you're not gonna be like, and I can understand that basically like what ends up happening is like if you're dealing with an organism that's larger than yourself, so a group, right? If you're dealing with a group that has procedures and then also a hierarchy, and like, you know, you're basically like the only way unfortunately, the higher, like you're gonna get to basically like have the override switches flipped is if you're consistent. And also, yeah, like eventually like everybody who's like interacting with me, right, gets affected enough that they start to like communicate to their uppers, and then they start fucking like, you know, and then they start communicating to their uppers, and you know what? It's a gigantic fucking pyramid scheme. That's how power works. It's a fucking pyramid. And I'm like you fucking idiots, like literally like they don't believe everybody's equal. And I'm like, okay, if you don't believe everybody's equal or whatever, or everybody doesn't have an equal right, then like, do you not believe everybody's equal? The other thing is, like, if I'm trying to get assisted suicide and I defined that like being consistent affects my ability to communicate, right? Like it affects like my coherency and understanding with regards to the chain of command or the pyramid scheme. They attack that. They flat out fucking attack that. So like, how'd they attack that? Like, well, my case went missing, you know? My case that had like the piece of plastic, like the laminated paper that I stuck to the glass that had my health card number, the 39999, like fucking health card number, like super in big font letters, so I didn't have to repeat myself, or I didn't have to like, you know, they weren't trying to read, because right now I switched to basically like, you know, I'll define this, and then I'm sure like they'll find a way of like, you know, like reducing this, but like if I'm holding like a little number up like that on a glass, right, and they're this far away, it doesn't work. But if the lettering is literally the size of this band, like if my health card number was literally the size of this band, it was very easy to read, right? So like they took that. They took my laminated sheet that enables me to quickly get through registration, so I can just have a seat, think about getting assisted dying, or devote my energies to asking, like, you know, the person at the registration desk, like, hey, how are you? You know what I mean? When they're asking me, like, what are you here for? Can I have your ID, please? And then, like, you know, if I have that gigantic sheet that I just put on there, it's literally like a gigant, like literally all the information they have is available to them. They don't have to ask me twice, 3 times, or even fucking make a mistake when they enter my information, which has happened before, which is why I got that fucking sheet. Again, they totally got what they want, because right now, like, yeah, I have to basically, like, I'm distracted because my consistency's messed up. So my procedure got fucked with, right? I can't actually follow the procedure I researched and developed, right? Because it was deliberately, in my opinion, sabotage. They said, like, oh, somebody just stole your case while you were sleeping. You know? I went to the washroom yesterday in an emergency department, and I left my bag. I left my fucking bag when I went to go to the washroom, right? And it was fine. So I've been conditioned, like, this entire time that it's, like, sort of okay to, like, leave your stuff around sometimes, right? And then if you fall asleep, anything's game, basically. I haven't had anything go missing. Literally, like, the only thing I've had go missing was that case. And I was like, yeah. And, like, I'm totally know that the person who took it was definitely influenced, probably by mind control, you know? And then they ended up probably just, like, going through it, walking it to the location where they were just, like, basically psychically supposed to, they were like, all right, well, we know this case is going to be useless to this person, so we can just get it from them after they just abandon it. They totally just steal things so that you have a false lead, right? And they basically take something of yours, run away with it, look at it, like, examine it more carefully, determine that it's fucking stupid, and then just leave it on the doorstep of the person who actually stole it, who mind controlled the person who fucking stole it. That sort of thing. Yeah, so when I asked security, I was like, do you know what they look like? I was already in my mindset. I was like, when I asked them, like, do you know the description of the person who took my stuff? I was already at the point where I was like, yeah, they could be shapeshifters, which is not as plausible in a lot of people's mind, but totally plausible in my world. And then, like, then from there, I was like, if they're not shapeshifters, they were hijacked. And then, yeah, hijacked meaning, like, in a desperate situation, right? And then vulnerable to basically vulnerable to outside thought. And then when you're vulnerable to outside thought, you do things that you would never do, you know? The other thing is, like, I'm in emergency, like, all the time. And while I'm there, there's, like, literally nobody that has any fucking problems. Like, their problems are generally, like, there are some people with some, like, actual problems, but in relation to the amount of times that I've been there, so, like, over 3 months consistently, like, in the same thing, like, either, like, patients are being rerouted away from my location where I'm in emergency departments, which is totally possible. So, like, they basically just go, like, okay, so, like, I'm in a train station right now, and, like, let's say, like, I gotta go to an emergency department. Maybe, like, all the emergency departments, like, talk to each other, and they're like, okay, we want, like, basically the safest, most undisturbed emergency department to go to. And then, you know, basically my route is just, like, to go to UHN first thing, because they're the biggest. I'll start there, right? So they just, like, you know, they just make sure that anytime, like, planning and scheduling, anytime I go to an emergency department, it's, like, literally nothing's happening, which is great. Like, honestly, like, that's the way it should be. But then when I'm there, it's, like, super ineffective, you know what I mean? I'm like, so if nothing's really going on in the waiting room, right? Like, nothing, like, nothing, like, super crazy is happening in the waiting room, then it's like, well, what's happening not in the emergency room, not in the waiting room, so where the ambulances are pulling people in, like, you know, it can't be, like, a super hectic, like, rush of, because I've been to the other side, right, where the operating rooms are or whatever, and, like, there's no, like, the times that I've been back there hasn't been, like, they're generally, people are not, like, in, like, people did not look like they were, like, all that beat up. They look, if anything, they look like more like they were super tired, and, like, affected over a long term, long-term damages. So like they were not like short, spontaneous looking accidents that happened to them. The people behind the emergency, so there's a waiting area, and then there's the people around back who came in ambulances. The people around back who came in ambulances just looked like they were, like they didn't have they weren't wearing casts, or they weren't like, I don't know, they didn't look like they'd just been hit by a car or something, you know what I mean? Like I never saw anybody that looked like there were not very many people who were like bloodied up, let's just say. Like, so like all the issues were kind of like unforeseeable, kind of just from, or like just at a glance I was like I don't know what's wrong with this person, you know what I mean? Like most of the people like I've seen, they were just like, yep, I have no idea what's wrong with any of these people, because there's no like visible cue or sign as to like what's wrong, you know what I mean? So yeah, because of that, I'm like I don't really know. I was like, yeah, so like basically the emergency departments feel like bullshit, right? Like what if there's an alternate reality where, basically I was in a church one time in Montreal or Quebec or something, and they had they had like basically like we were in the basement, or it was like there was an alcove in like a separate entrance that was just like, no, it wasn't an entrance, it was basically like near the entrance there was like an alcove, like sort of like that. Right, sort of like that, but then it was just like stuffed with crutches, right? And we're like, oh, what are all these crutches for? And it's like, oh, well, like God cured them or whatever. And I was like, oh, right. But realistically, like, in my opinion, there's outposts or whatever. So like, like in Cloud Atlas or whatever, where basically the aliens come down to Earth. They're like, which is totally wrecked, and then they're basically on a boat spaceship, and they visit tribes or whatever. And then when they're fixing people, they can't actually like fix people. And sort of like Star Trek too, where they just like make interventions, right? And then to not interfere with basically like the religious beliefs of like the indigenous communities, they can't like, if they intervene, they can't like present themselves as space travelers. So they just hide the fact that they're space travelers. So basically, like, in my opinion, like, because hospitals are not as frequent as churches, and churches are so dominant and have been so dominant for so long that I'm sure like there's some kind of like, I guess, alien alliance with basically churches because they're more common, right? But realistically, they shouldn't be like, at this point, now that we have like modern medicine, because the aliens were probably helping the church, and they're like, come on, you fucking idiots, like literally, like stop promoting the fucking, bullshit, right? And then they do, and then it's just like, okay, and then basically like enough people like in the church community sort of got scientific, and then they started like, getting into actual like health and sciences, and then like from there they, like, instead of like, like having a system where all the money just goes to a church, then it goes to a democracy, and then after it's going to a democracy, like yeah, so like basically, like, in my opinion, churches were the first democracy or whatever, because just because they were the first doesn't mean they're the best. You know what I mean? Like, it's literally like, it's just an old, outdated system that we still have because of basically tradition. The traditions don't actually benefit us, to my knowledge, like, at all. They just benefit a group. It's a pyramid scheme. So if you're participating in a religion, in my opinion, it's just a fucking giant pyramid scheme, And then, yeah. So like, when some people like, so I'm sure basically the church has a monopoly on certain like hospitals or whatever. I wouldn't be surprised if they were like, I don't want to like basically like say that anybody's my enemy, because like I'm gonna make everybody my bitch. But like, so when I have like a bunch of hospitals or whatever that I'm visiting, like maybe the church community, because it's so large, basically just hijack that, and then they just have like basically a doctrine where they're trying to just maintain their power, in my opinion. So like it's just like about like maintaining some. It's not about what you make, it's about what you save, right? Like that's a pretty good like accounting rule for basically just saving money. But like realistically, like if it's power, you can think of it that way too. So it's not about what you make, it's about what you save. So like literally like they have philosophical beliefs, or they have spiritual beliefs where they have to save people, right? So like I get approached by a bunch of random people on the street. Doesn't at all feel like gang stalking, but they go like, oh, God, and I'm like, no, stop it, like, science. And then they go like, they kind of look at me like, someone who's not saved, basically. And I'm like, it's just like if I feel heartbroken for these people, they probably also feel heartbroken. The problem is like they have a monopoly or whatever, so it's like, yeah, it's like whatever. Like I'm done. Like what do they know that I don't? Like, but when I'm talking to them, like they're not able to logic it out in a way that like makes sense. You know what I mean? So if they're like God or whatever, and then I was like, do you believe in aliens? And they're like, I'm not sure. And I was like, because technically your God's an alien, right? If it's not actually from Earth and it created Earth, it's an alien, And then some people go like, oh yeah, And then some people are like, they just ignore it and like they pretend they didn't hear it or something. And I'm like, okay, like very interesting. The people who like kind of hear it out, I actually think they're just like bullshitting, and they're just like they just promote basically things that are false. You know what I mean? So sort of like Santa Claus. You know what I mean? Some people are like, they're like, oh, there's a human, because I'm probably like marked somehow, and then they go like, well, let's just talk to him about Santa Claus. Let's tell him stories about Santa Claus. And then they're like, hey human, how about Santa Claus? And then I'm like, fuck Santa Claus. And then they go like, oh, okay. And then they like, yeah. And I'm just like every time, I'm like, yeah, I know I look like a kid human, but like, I'm like, yeah, I'm sick of it. Like people basically, yeah, I don't want to be here anymore. Like, I'm just like, I'm trying to go politely. I'm trying to go like, but at the same time, like if you're taking a position, so I'm not taking a position against a church. I'm not taking a position against like society or the hospital system or government or whatever. Like I'm like, you know what? Like I don't fucking care. Your network's way bigger than me. Like you gotta like I was like, who am I to say like with a high school and college education is to like, like I can't judge. And then also like I'm not smart enough to basically like chip in, so like I'm gonna leave. You know what I mean? But just respect my decision to leave. And then the other thing is like I'm pretty sure that like I'm being held because like if I'm successful in leaving, then like basically like other parts of their herd, right, may be affected as well. And I'm like, I'm happy to go. Like I just want to go legally. It doesn't mean that like, I want to go out with I don't want to go out with a bang, but they're trying to basically like encourage me. They're trying to rile me up to basically go out with a bang, but it's not like they want the bang to be like on their terms, and then once it's on their terms, they want to make sure it fails like wonderfully. They want it to fail wonderfully so that like they have an excuse to keep me here. You know what I mean? So I'm like, okay, like at all times, like don't lose your cool, right? At the same time, acknowledge that they're trying to make you lose your cool. And at the same time, like the people who end up just like getting like literally like simmed into your location don't understand that they're actually like fucking terrorists to you. They don't like, so like literally like everybody that comes up to me most of the time is basically a fucking terrorist with regards to keeping me like I want assisted dying, and they basically do everything they have no idea, but they're actually just like doing stuff that's just like actual terrorism to me, but they have no idea. So they're completely innocent. They basically took like fucking sheep, right? And they strapped like fucking TNT to them, and then they just like, you know, literally had like shepherd dogs like fucking like, you know, dance around or whatever, and then like I got like fucking sheep with fucking bombs attached to them just like, you know, running up to me, right? And I'm like, it's okay because I'm wearing like a, literally this is a metaphor, so if the sheep don't actually have like, if the humans don't actually have like bombs strapped to them, I'm okay, right? But metaphorically, they all have bombs on them, right? And they will realize that they have bombs on them, you know, and they will realize after we've interacted, like probably long in the future, that like I was actually trying to help, and that it's in their interest, and it was in their interest, like in that moment that they were speaking to me, to like just basically support me and not actually get in my way, right? But it's going to be long, like it'll be long gone, like literally like in the future or whatever, they're like, oh fuck, I should have tried to help that guy, you know what I mean? I was telling him to move, or I was telling him like about God, or I was telling him about like, you know, whatever. Like if you let it, like if we just bro down and have a conversation about like how to make things better, I don't care, you know what I mean? I'm happy to sit here and wait to go to the emergency department to get assisted death, but talk about like how to make things better in the meantime, right? But if you're gonna talk about fucking God or something, I'm like, or a religion, or you're gonna talk like, I don't even want to give those things lip service, but I keep having to, right? Because they monopolize. They literally like certain, like if I'm interacting with things and I'm like okay, like I'm in a train station, you know what I mean? Like right now I should make like literally the sponsor of this fucking video should be just the fucking train station, you know, and how we should have just like trains going everywhere, you know what I mean? Like more train lines, and then also like more underground train lines. So trains like that are like subways, you know, just subways everywhere. And then like the rail lines that are above ground get turned into just like gigantic gardens, you know, and like wild path, like nature paths, right? Not into highways, right? And then like, yeah, and then everybody just is allowed to like, and then transit becomes free or whatever, and like develop tunneling machines, and then like also develop tunnels like over the tunnels that we have for transit, so that like we can run all our hydro, gas, you know, basically like all our utilities. We could have like a separate line where basically like a human and like a little tiny, like a mini subway car can run through and just like basically do line maintenance, you know, like a tunnel shaft that's basically like, you know, accessible and comfortable for someone to work in, right? You know, well ventilated or whatever, that's just got all the utilities, right? And then every building on the network, if it's a life support system, is connected through basically like a vein artery system of tunnels that, like, you know, instead of like above ground utilities where there's like street poles, and it's like the street poles don't really do anything in a lot of instances, and like you're just, yeah, because like tunneling is so advanced now that like it's actually like it can be autonomized, and like it's not, you're not using like inexpensive and also like abusive labor techniques. Like you literally, like, we just build like machines to just dig our holes for us, right? And if you look throughout history, like humans are design-built beings, you know. It's actually kind of really fucking depressing, like in actual fact, like, you know, like that's why I'm vegan. Like, so if you got like animals or whatever, and you're eating animals, and you think about like what we have done to animals as human beings, and then you say there's no aliens, like I hope you believe there's no aliens at that point, you know what I mean? Because like, yeah, like I've eaten fucking animals like most of my life, you know, and then I've contributed to that system, and now I'm thinking, I'm like, wow, I probably have like if every animal you ate left like a trace signature as to how much you've consumed or whatever, then like I'd be marked for life with regards to basically participating in that system, and I would be marked for life with regards to getting the same kind of treatment from aliens, you know? So like the only thing I can really do is vote with what I eat and what I do, right? So like the aliens who may or may not understand us basically go like, if they're looking, you know, if they hyper focus on one of us, which is extremely unlikely, right? They would notice that I'm repetitively, because like if we're all ants in an ant farm, we all look the same, right? So like if you just see like, so if you see a human from like a bird's eye view walking around, like you're not going to be able to distinguish one from the other, right? So I could actually like be attempting to communicate with aliens for the rest of my life by going to emergency departments and not eating meat, like, and it having literally no effect. Like it's not gonna like affect anything. Because could you imagine if there was an ant, right? And there's just like, you know, and ants are a lot more organized than humans, that's for sure. So like if they have like, you know, if they're going for food or whatever, there's literally a line of them to and from the food. You know, like a fucking line, like a train line, fucking, you know, and then, you know, if one is deviated from the path or whatever, like you probably wouldn't notice like one or two deviating from the path and like, you know, going for something else, like a fallen fruit, you know, opposed to like, you know, another creature or something like. Yeah, so literally, like, I'm just saying, I'm like, listen, like, if you arrive at the same conclusion as me, which is doubtful, because, like, in my opinion, the things that control us all have a monopoly. So, like, and if you're not aware of the monopoly, then it's just like you're playing along, and if you're playing along, you're probably like a gutless piece of shit. And then, if you're a gutless piece of shit and you're playing along, then you're actually interested in basically like using me to basically figure out how to make your life easier in the future, right? Because you're like, oh, the way he's going is actually probably the way it's gonna go no matter what, but like right now's not a convenient time for me to be going vegan, and not a convenient time for me, like that's not an effective use of my time requesting assisted dying for the rest of my life, right? They're just going like, they're like, oh yeah, well, the procedures aren't there yet, but basically we need people on the ground requesting it to create basically the legislation or whatever to just have it passed. And I'm like, I don't give a fuck. You know? And if there is a God, and that's what's going on, then like, yeah, I don't believe there's a God, basically, because I believe the reason people believe there is a God is because there's people who actually support my decision who pretend to be God all the time, secretly, right? They secretly pretend to be God. No, they don't secretly pretend to be God. They openly make God-like moves, but they don't take any responsibility, and they hide their involvement, right? So like I said, like, you know, when you go into that church, or like that church, I think near Ottawa or whatever, and there's the crutches in the alcove, something like that. Like I was like, when I was younger, I was like, they were basically like, oh yeah, no, people just came in here and like they were just like all of a sudden healed, and then they just walk out, right? They're like, if you don't believe me, then like they were like, well, that's what happened, Harley. Like literally, people would walk into the church with injuries and then walk out perfectly fine, you know, because they were saved. And I was like, okay, you know, like literally, I was like, that doesn't seem very likely at all, like, or scientific, right? And they're like, that's what happened. I was like, okay, so like there's modern medicine, you know, like I know that like bones don't heal themselves and injuries don't heal themselves, but like if we're talking miracles here, then like it's not miracles in my opinion. It's just like aliens with the ability to basically like field, diagnose, and treat wounds and injuries on site, opposed to having people brought to a facility, right, and then healed that way. So basically they have like hospitals condensed into probably like, you know, the form of like who could probably impersonate like someone who, yeah, like a priest or whatever, probably a priest or a nun, and then also like, yeah, or like an outside source that's like a healer or like a, you know, sort of. But the thing is, those healers or whatever, or like, you know, there's they probably like tout the line of basically like something that encourages like ideas that have to do with faith, instead of like, because they're like, okay, well, like, you know, because time travel hasn't been invented yet, and because teleporting hasn't been invented yet, and because of like all this super crazy impossible things haven't been invented yet, like we can't actually tell the humans like how it works, because they have no reference points with their education systems yet to like learn, and we don't necessarily want them to learn yet, because like we got to use them for like resource extraction. So like if we're using them for resource extraction, we can't necessarily like make them awares as to how everything works, because like, you know, then we wouldn't get what we want, which is resource extraction, right? You know, it's just like, yeah, I'm really fucking annoyed. I'm just like totally disheartened, like all hope gone, faithless, but in the most like positive way, because it's just like, you know what, like, yeah, I know I can like live with myself and talk to myself for the rest of my life, like it's totally fine, you know. And I'm actually like grateful that they allowed me to keep my phone, but realistically I'm doing their own reconnaissance. So it's just like, they're like, okay, well, we can definitely like influence the thoughts in his head, right? But like, you know, what about when like we can just like, we'll just like, you know, based on we know we know what's going on in his head, because like, you know, if we mind control him to get up and go get food right now, then like we have verification that he wants to go up and go get food right now, right? If he starts heading in the direction of like where, you know, based on his routine or whatever, we know he's going to get food at like a certain location, right? But it's just helpful to like have the extra assurance and reconnaissance with, to me, basically providing the intel, which is like, I'm hungry and I kind of want to go to that drop-in center in Augusta and Queen and get like, you know, probably a peanut butter sandwich or like whatever they have for meals, with regards to hopefully a vegan diet. But generally they don't have vegan over there. They just have like vegetarian, you know, or if they have something that's like pretty close to being vegan, they just put some fucking butter in it or something. And I'm like, okay, you know, thanks for marking me so that the aliens can identify that I've had animal products, guys. And, yeah, like that's okay. But like realistically, like the people, the staff or whatever that I come into contact with, like, so realistically, the staff who prepared the meal, the staff who handed out the meal, the staff who basically are in charge of like intake and meal plans, they're not the ones to blame, right? But they're the only ones that I could and like I'm only interacting with the person handing it out, you know? So like I'm literally blocked from interacting with the people who actually would have influence over what I put in my fucking mouth. And then I'm like, there's no winning. You know what I mean? There's no winning. I'm like, I don't understand like why people don't support assisted suicide yet. I'm like, you fucking idiots. I'm like, okay. You know what I mean? Like, doesn't mean they're idiots. It just means they're afraid, right? Like, and when you say like, when I say like I'm afraid of living, I'm like, oh yeah, no, I'm afraid of living. You know what I mean? I'm like, I can die tomorrow. It doesn't mean I'm afraid of dying, but I'm definitely afraid of living, right? But at this point, like, I can live for the rest of my life, which could be 100 years, right? requesting assisted dying. But I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, you know, like, it's not like, would you want to be going to the emergency department, you know, asking for the same thing for 100 years? Maybe over 100 years? Like, I don't think you would, you know? And at the same time, I'm like, yeah, like, there's no, like, and if you've basically had anything, like, if you're asking me for, like, you're like, what's your reason for being alive, you know? Like, what, and I'm just like, they're like, why do you want assisted dying? I'm like, why do you want to be alive? By the way, like, anything I think in terms of me wanting to be alive, like, I'm like, oh, it'd be nice to go here to do this because, like, that's where my heart is, or that's where that's where I want to go, or that's the energies that I want. Like, something actually picks that up. Something picks that up and, like, pulls it out and then, like, scrambles it, right? And then I'm, like, watching it just basically like get crunched. You know what I mean? I'm just, like, watching it just get crunched, and then they just, like, you know, basically do that. They do something like that, basically. So, like, anytime I think of something that I love or that, like, interests me, it just gets pulled out of my head and then, like, crunched in front of me. And then I'm like, did anybody see that? And they're like, no, nobody saw that, Harley, and nobody's going to be able to empathize with you. Yeah, so basically, like, in my opinion, they're actually looking for answers that are basically, like, their worst nightmare, or answers that are upsetting because they want to demonize me. You know what I mean? Like, if I want assisted dying, you know, and everybody's against assisted dying because they don't want, like, easy accessibility for basically their loved ones to basically potentially just, like, show up and die one day, you know, like, on their own schedule, then, like, you know, without warning, because I support assisted suicide for no reason, basically. So, like, and I would have taken my life, like, in my teenage years easily if that was sort of, if it was actually available, probably. Because it isn't, I didn't. And I kind of was like, oh, well, you know what, like, I'll give it an honest shot. Like, you know, I was like, oh, like, you know, like, and then I was like, wait a second, like, giving it an honest shot is actually not what it's about, because the lies are so fucking strong. And I'm like, if the lies are this strong, right, then there's literally nothing I can do other than believe them, right? And then if I don't believe them, I gotta be honest about it. And then if I'm honest about not believing their lies, then it just gets a target pointed on my back, right? Or then I'm just like, literally, like, if I speak my mind, I'm like, oh, like, yeah, like, this situation seems like bullshit. They just say, like, well, suck it up and go away then. You know what I mean? Suck it up or go away then. You know what I mean? And I'm like, I don't want to suck it up. You know, like, I think this is really bad that, like, we're being kept here. Like, we're being kept here. Like, why? I was like, you shouldn't be forced to stay if you don't want to stay, right? If you're at a party, like, and you want to leave, you can generally leave. You know, like, there's, like, some variables or whatever. There might be a delay in you being allowed to leave. So, like, I'm hoping that's what this is. Literally, like, I'm hoping that this is all just basically, like, some fucked up thing where it's just like, yeah, it's actually we're all at a party or whatever, and, like, there was some kind of mix up at the party, basically, and everybody thought I was, like, some kind of asshole, or, like, I had to be removed or whatever. And, like, you know what, like, I'm happy. I don't even care at this point. Like, you can make me out to be an asshole, but, like, because you know what, the people who are making me out to be an asshole actually know how good I am, and we're probably like, oh, well, you know what, and they're using me as a tool to basically scare their flock or something. And I'm like, you know what, yeah, I'm like, call it for what it is, like, because you know what, the flock isn't going to get a fair representation as to what I am, right? I've had really good conversations with a whole bunch of fucking people, like just on the street, just like everywhere, right? Where I just like I made sure I did a good enough job, even like a like an outstanding job in my opinion of just like raising them up and not actually like, you know, like putting them down. Like I don't want to put anybody down. I'm like so fucking annoyed. Like I do not want to put anybody down. They're basically like asking me to fucking put people down so that they have an excuse to basically like demonize me. And I'm like, okay, like you call it for what it is. Like you want me to be a fucking demon? It's just like I'll be a fucking demon. But the thing is, like, it's not sustainable if you don't take me out of context. And if I'm going to set the intention right now that if you take me out of context in any way, shape, or form, which you will be, right? I'm taking myself out of context by just like providing basically like an influence, right? So like if I have like an Instagram and I have like a YouTube and I have like a Facebook, like I'm already out of context because I just said I've had amazing conversations with nurses, doctors, people on the street, friends, family that are totally unaccounted for and monopolized.